Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for choosing to be here for another week. Last week was a holiday week for me, so I was pretty unplugged. So thanks for, giving me that opportunity to get off of social media for a little bit and enjoy time with family. I hope that all of you who potentially celebrate holidays that have come and gone at this point have enjoyed those days with hopefully your loved ones, friends, family, chosen family, everything in between. Just remember that this podcast would not be anything without you. So if you could rate, review, subscribe, share this episode, share the show in general, it would go so far, and I just would appreciate it so much. This week is another solo episode. Me and you chit-chatting for another week. Next week, I'm going to be back with a guest episode that I think you're really going to enjoy. I'm telling you, these future episodes with guests are amazing. And actually, as I continue to edit them, it just reminds me how exciting it is to have a podcast where I can speak to people who are like-minded, not like-minded, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, HR people, everything in between. It's a really cool opportunity, honestly, and it does not get old. I've been doing this now for almost 2 years, which honestly sounds insane. Because let me think about that. I started my first episode was November 2020. Yeah, and November 2021 passed. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. So yeah, almost 2 years, and it just doesn't get old. And sometimes I think to myself, will I be podcasting when I'm 65 years old? And I could see how that's totally a possibility because it's really fun and I get to meet really amazing people. And who knows where I'll be in 35 years with this podcast. Maybe it'll be a daytime talk show. Who knows? I doubt it, but hey, you never know. This week, I want to talk about this concept of raises or inflation raises specifically. It's come up a lot, and I have some specific opinions on it that I think you'll probably want to hear about. And, I bring this up because we've talked about inflation before, I think, or at least I've gone on a tangent on Instagram about how inflation and unemployment are related. But to give you a quick reminder, synopsis, background, inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship. So that means when inflation is up, unemployment is low. When unemployment is up or high, inflation is low. And so this is something, luckily, that I remembered from my economics classes, both in high school, undergrad, and my master's programs. And I think it's actually really helpful to know this because it allows us to kind of predict some changes in the market, and whether it's through labor or just in economics in general, and how we can better not only predict but understand the way that things change. So you might have seen that with the rise in inflation, specifically in the United States, the unemployment rate started to drop. This is not a fluke. This is not a coincidence. This, again, is related to the inflation rate and unemployment rate having an inverse relationship. Of course, it goes without saying, I'm not an economics expert, but this is the gist of the information that I have, that I understand, and that I'd like to share with you. So understanding this and understanding that inflation has now impacted us pretty significantly in the United States. Obviously, consumer prices have gone up significantly. Actually, apparently they rose 8.5% year over year in March, which is the highest inflation rate since 1981. And this is according to the BLS, which is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, where I get a lot of my statistics from, most of them actually. And so super high, which means that cost of goods are high. The cost of living is high. Everything is super high. And so naturally, unemployment rates are going to be lower because we have to be able to afford this increase in cost of living, generally speaking. So there's a lot of conversation around inflation raises, cost of living raises, et cetera, et cetera. Here's my hot take. Cost of living increases have always existed and they make sense. Inflation raises don't make sense. And some of you might say, well, aren't they the same thing? To me, they're not the same thing. Cost of living increases can be reflective of inflation for sure, but also they are reflective of where you live. So inflation will have a more significant impact on people living in more expensive areas like New York, New Jersey, California, but less of an impact on lower cost of living in places, right? So whether there's high inflation or not, cost of living increases need to consistently be a consideration for compensation evaluations, because regardless of whether there's inflation or not, because there isn't always high inflation, if someone is living in a high cost of living area, that cost of living could actually just naturally go up. Like in New York and New Jersey, for example, California as well, the tax rates, sales tax rates, income tax rates, those things can go up whether or not there's inflation, and that increases the cost of living. And that, again, might not have anything to do with the cost of goods or inflation, so to speak. So cost of living increases to me make sense if you are a profitable public or private business that can reasonably afford to increase the amount that your employees are earning year after year based on, different survey data and other data that's out there as far as cost of living goes. The reason why I'm not totally in favor of inflation raises is because inflation can last a long time. It can last a short time. It can, it's pretty, it can be predicted, but it's in my understanding tells me that it can be a little bit less clear how long something can last from an inflation perspective. So to give an increase based on something that's a bit less clear and set in stone is not a good business decision. Where I think it differs with cost of living is that when taxes go up, they are not going back down. So at least I've never seen them go back down. And so that is a permanent mark of the cost of living being increased. And although, you see there are certain areas now around the country, especially that were at one point, considered low cost of living that are no longer that way. So businesses have to adapt their cost of living metrics and analyses to incorporate and really accommodate these changes. But cost of living is much more permanent versus inflation. Inflation is not permanent. It can be low and it can be high. When we think about in 2020, for example, where inflation was not high, things were pretty inexpensive. People were, in terms of demand, the demand was higher, cost of goods were potentially a little bit lower until manufacturers weren't able to keep up and actually supply the demand. And so obviously this is all related. Again, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that, the price of goods is elastic. So where we have higher inflation, we're going to make decisions on what we spend and where we spend based on the elasticity of the goods. I'm not going to go into a whole economics lecture because, again, not an expert here, but I know that, for example, consumer goods like clothing are a bit more elastic because you might choose that the cost is too high and maybe you don't need it, and so you save your money. Whereas when inflation is lower and the cost of goods is a little bit lower, maybe your money is going a bit further, you're going to spend on those items. It's interesting, like having worked in retail my entire life, but especially through COVID, the price of goods was definitely lower from what I saw. And on top of that, people were making money in different ways, whether they were receiving unemployment checks or stimulus checks, things like that. They were able to put that money into things that before they might not have put money into. And so like luxury goods, for example, were still something that people consumed. Actually, they probably consumed it more. And so you see the influence of the cost of goods, especially on the demand of those goods, for, individuals. Luxury goods, they never change in price. In fact, they probably always go up year after year, but people still consume them. So anyway, again, I'm kind of digressing here, and I'm potentially diluting some of the core principles of economics here. But if you are an economics expert and I mess something up, please feel free to message me. Hopefully I got it right. I think I got some of the principles right there, but always, always, always Google things for yourself too. You guys know I always say this. I have my own opinions, my own thoughts, my own experiences and learnings, but you should also find things out for yourself and take what I say with a grain of salt, especially if I'm sharing my opinions. So anyway, coming back to this cost of living versus inflation raise, I think inflation raises could be a great way to retain people short term. But the reality is that if you are providing an inflation increase and the cost of living goes down, then now your business is putting out even more money than what was previously anticipated in the budgeting process, and it might not be the best business decision. Whereas cost of living increases are typically built into the budgets of profitable businesses. And when I say profitable, I mean businesses that are not like startups or seeking funding from investors, because that's obviously a little bit different. Your money is tied to the people who are giving you the money. So I kind of feel like this is a hot take, because I do think there are a lot of articles out there right now where people are really saying that they expect or want inflation raises. And there are also articles out there that are saying that employers are really giving a lot of money out for inflation. But again, I mean, I don't know that it's a long-term solution. Money is not going to solve the problems that are tied to current attrition rates within organizations. So obviously, I'm kind of sharing this perspective as an HR business leader and sharing this to other HR business leaders. If you're an employee and thinking in the employee mindset, like even if I think as an employee, like, gosh, yeah, I'd love an inflation raise, but that's not me thinking with a leadership cap, right? So if I take off my leadership cap and I'm an employee, then I'm going to expect that my business increases my pay because it's expensive out here. If I'm thinking with my leadership cap on, then I might think a little bit more differently, just even more critically, I guess I should say, just in the reality that, inflation happens and we might not always be able to raise salaries as a result. Also, keep in mind that we are in really toward the end of the typical annual review process for most organizations. And if I were a business leader executing the, merit increase process within my organization, I would say, hey, why don't we, take what we've budgeted and maybe increase it a little bit. Maybe it's by a certain percentage point or half a percentage point, so that inflation and cost of living and merit can all be tied together. I think it's a bit more stabilizing and from a business decision, from a business perspective, I should say. I think when you make a decision as a business that's based on one specific moment in time, like inflation being very high right now, I don't think that is a good way to make informed, equitable, and consistent decisions. Because then what would happen is, let's say next year inflation is lower, then people are going to say, okay, well, are they going to lower my pay? Like, it might feel too unstable. It might feel too reliant on current events. Again, whereas cost of living, that is like something that is typically taken into consideration with budgeting. And I would imagine that most employers set aside a pretty decent budget for increases. Actually, the Wall Street Journal said that employers set aside an average of 3.9% of total payroll for wage increases in 2022, which is the most since 2008, according to the Conference Board, which is a research group. So that's pretty significant. I don't think it's reasonable for us as employees to expect a merit increase and then also an inflation raise or a cost of living increase. In my experience, whenever I've had a cost of living increase, it's always been tied into merit. So it's like this one thing. And maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. I think it just is. And anytime I've received any kind of increase in general, I've always been very grateful for it because money costs a lot, right? Like paying people more is a huge impact or has a huge impact on a business. Payroll costs are the highest cost for a business. So I think as employees, we could probably do a better job of thinking a little bit more critically about what it takes to run a business. Obviously, as employees, we want what we want and we want to be paid, one, fairly, but two, well. And so if you're not being paid fairly, that's obviously a totally separate issue with the organization, the culture of the organization, and their values, right? But let's say we are being paid fairly. We can all look up, average salaries based on where we live, the size of a company, and our titles. Then, I think it's a great thing if a company is still, giving an increase. I always, being very driven and wanting to continue to climb the ladder, both in title and in pay, of course. That's what experience is all about. You want to be paid for your experience and your knowledge and what you bring to the table. I also always kind of think a little bit critically about, well, what is fair? Am I expecting too much? Am I expecting too little? Because you can definitely expect too little. But I do think that there's probably an opportunity for employees to think a bit more like business people and like entrepreneurs. If you're running your own business, you're not going to pay everyone the same amount. And certainly you're not going to pay everyone at the top of the, of the range because not everyone has the experience or the value add yet to be paid at the top of the range. So pay is obviously a huge conversation. And I certainly am not saying that people shouldn't ask for more money or that you shouldn't expect more because, if you've listened to my episodes on this podcast, that I always think we should be expecting not only a fair wage, but more for ourselves and, really negotiating what we want to earn from a total compensation package perspective. But we also have to be realistic and think about, well, what if this was my business? And again, there are employers out there for sure who take advantage and who are not paying people fairly, which is a totally separate issue than like a cost of living increase or something like that. So I think as employees, if we can all think a bit more like entrepreneurs, a bit more like business leaders ourselves, whether we're in a leadership role or not, it will make us a bit more understanding of the situation that we're in or the place that we're in within our organizations. But it would also allow us to potentially influence some of the business decisions, right? Because if you're thinking like a business owner in your role and you're really owning your business, that's something we always talked about in retail, like own your business, then you are thinking of things more critically and you're asking questions that, the CEO or the CFO or the executive leaders are constantly having to answer to. So I think if we can, again, think more critically about this, it'll help us to develop better understanding of the ways that these processes impact businesses at their top and bottom line. For people who are not being paid fairly, who are being paid far below where they should be paid, then the issue there is that the organization is not fairly evaluating, the value that they're adding to the organization, what a livable wage looks like, et cetera, et cetera. And so that person then who is potentially underpaid or being paid an unfair wage needs to ask for an increase, whether it's cost of living, merit, or just a fair increase to equalize them based on the market. So most decisions that businesses make to bring underpaid people up is in a cost of living increase, which I think is interesting because it's basically just a way that businesses phrase it. So it's not like, hey, we've been underpaying you this entire time, so we're going to give you a cost of living increase because it's our bad. They're saying, hey, cost of living has gone up, and so we want to make sure that you're, appropriately compensated. And so we're going to give you a $5,000 increase to, have a better wage. They're not saying congratulations. They're not saying your performance was amazing. They're just saying, hey, we had to raise your pay. And so businesses should be doing this. They should be looking at where their employees are sitting. And if you go back to my episode on pay transparency, I talk about this, that for the organizations that have to comply with the new New York law around pay transparency and publishing internal and external job posts with the range, that they would then need to do that groundwork to make sure that the people within their organization actively working today are actually within that range. And so those people, if they were below the range, probably got a cost of living increase. Maybe they also got a merit increase, or maybe it was all folded into one, which usually is the way that it goes. But that is another reason why I think cost of living increases are different than inflation raises, because again, cost of living increases can be related to taxes and where you're actually living or where you've moved to, if you've moved for the organization, or it can be the company actually level setting your pay to be within the range that, they've now decided is the range for the role. And to me, again, this is a much better business decision. So if you are in a leadership role, I encourage you to think more broadly about the way in which pay is structured within an organization. Again, keeping in mind that payroll costs are the most expensive part of a business. And oftentimes we see this push and pull between leaders and employees. Employees want to earn more, leaders need to optimize their payroll, and how do you do it all at once? And there's definitely a way to do it. You can make employees happy while also optimizing. A lot of that comes down to like who you're paying to do what kind of roles you're opening, why people are leaving, making sure you're improving attrition and things like that, or improving retention, I should say. And all of that allows us to better understand the market and where we sit today. Now, I would imagine if inflation starts to go down, that the unemployment rate might, go up a little bit, but because people are still now, entering the workforce again, and the unemployment rate is going down because of inflation going up, that hopefully unemployment will be a little bit more stable and hopefully at a lower rate compared to where we were last year and in 2020, which obviously led to or contributed to the labor shortage that we've been working through. But now employers are confronted with more people coming back into the workplace, again, because inflation is high, unemployment is low. So we have people coming back into the workplace, and yet we need to pay them appropriately. We need to offer them good benefits, and we need to make sure that we're actually solving for the challenges that have led to the attrition that businesses have had over the last almost 2 years. And unless businesses fix that and solution those challenges, they're going to be back at the labor shortage dilemma that they've had since 2020. So we'll see how all of this plays out. Those are my hot takes. I hope it wasn't too confusing. For anyone who is an expert in economics, I hope I got it right. I think I did. I think I got the gist of it. But thank you again for being here for another week. Next week, I have a very exciting guest discussion for you, which will be on video, so stay tuned. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Connect with me on Instagram and email me, chat me, whatever, however you want to reach out. I am here. I'd love to answer any questions you have. And as another gentle reminder, you can submit audio questions. So you can actually call in, so to speak. If you go to anchor.fm/HRTracy, you'll see a link there, a button to send a message. So try it out. I haven't had anyone submit it yet, but if I do get some submissions, hopefully that would mean that I'd be able to play these submissions within the podcast. So this is new technology I'm trying out. Anyway, thank you again for being here. I will see you next week.